Imagine a man who burned the greatest city in the world and then sang about it. Not metaphorically, not in a poem written years later. He literally stood on a tower, dressed in theatrical robes, playing a lyre, reciting verses he had written himself, while Rome turned to ash below him. Over 1 million people lost everything that night, and the man responsible called it beautiful. But here's what nobody tells you about Nero. He didn't start as a monster. He started as a boy, a frightened, lonely, artistic boy, raised in one of the most dangerous households in the history of human civilization. A boy who was manipulated, weaponized, and ultimately consumed by a system so corrupt, so ruthless, so absolutely drunk on power, that it turned a child into a god, and then into a beast. This is not just the story of a bad emperor. This is the story of how Rome itself created Nero. And once you understand that, once you see the machinery behind the madness, you will never look at history the same way again. Let's go back to the beginning. The year is 37 AD. Rome is the most powerful empire on the face of the earth. At its height, it controls over 5 million square kilometers of territory. It rules somewhere between 60 and 90 million people, roughly a quarter of the entire human population of the planet. And at the center of all of it sits one man, one family, one dynasty, the Julio-Claudians. These are not normal people. These are people who have redefined what power means, what excess looks like, what cruelty can become when no one can stop you. In the 4 emperors before Nero, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, Rome had already seen paranoia, murder, sexual depravity, and divine madness elevated to the highest office on earth. Nero was born into that family. He didn't choose it. He couldn't escape it. And in many ways, what he became was simply the logical conclusion of everything that came before him. His full name at birth was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, one of the most terrifying women in the ancient world. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man so cruel, so vile, that ancient historians describe him as someone who never did anything praiseworthy in his entire life. When Nero was born, his father reportedly told friends that any child produced from himself and Agrippina could only be abominable and a public disaster. His own father said that. He was 3 years old when that father died, and then the real danger began. Agrippina the Younger is one of history's most fascinatingly terrifying figures. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the sister of Caligula, and eventually the wife of Claudius. She had survived court purges, exile, sexual violence, and assassination attempts, and she had come out the other side not broken, but sharpened. She had one goal, one obsession that drove every decision she ever made. She wanted her son on the throne of Rome. Not because she loved him unconditionally, not out of simple maternal warmth. She wanted it because the throne was the only thing in Rome that was worth wanting. It was protection. It was legacy. It was survival at the highest possible level. And she would do anything to get him there. When Nero was young, she was temporarily exiled by her own brother, the Emperor Caligula. Nero was left in poverty, cared for by an aunt, educated by a dancer and a barber. This is not a joke. The future emperor of Rome, the most powerful man on earth, was raised for a period of his childhood by people Rome considered the lowest of the low. He learned to perform, to entertain, to move in ways that made people feel something. Those early years shaped him in ways that the palace never could. When Caligula was assassinated in 41 AD, stabbed 30 times by his own Praetorian guards in a palace corridor, his uncle Claudius became emperor, and Agrippina saw her window. She came back to Rome. She positioned herself. She played the long game with a patience and a cunning that bordered on genius. And in 49 AD, she achieved the unthinkable. She married Claudius, her own uncle. Rome was shocked, even by Roman standards, where the rules of family, power, and decency had always been somewhat flexible. This felt wrong. But Agrippina didn't care. She had a plan, and the plan was working. Within a year, she convinced Claudius to adopt her son Lucius as his own. And just like that, the boy born to a man who predicted disaster The boy, raised by a dancer and a barber, became heir to the Roman Empire. He was given a new name, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. He was 12 years old. Now, here's where the story gets deeply, uncomfortably human. Because before Nero became the monster history remembers, before the murder, before the fire, before the madness, there was a period, a brief golden window, when Nero was actually good. Not perfect, not innocent, but genuinely trying. He took the throne at 17 years old in 54 AD, after Claudius died, almost certainly poisoned by Agrippina using mushrooms, though she was never formally charged. And in his first years as emperor, Nero governed with a moderation that surprised everyone. He worked closely with his tutor, the philosopher Seneca, and with his praetorian prefect Burrus. Together, these three created what later historians call the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. He reduced taxes. He gave his Senate more authority. He publicly announced that he would govern based on the principles of Augustus. He banned bloody gladiatorial combat at first. He gave gifts to the poor. Senators who had braced for another Caligula looked at each other in quiet astonishment. Could this boy actually be different? The answer, tragically, was not for long, because standing directly behind him, controlling every room he walked into, whispering in his ear from the moment he woke up to the moment he slept, was Agrippina. And Agrippina was not interested in a good emperor. She was interested in being the power behind the emperor. In the early months of Nero's reign, coins were minted with both their faces on them, side by side, equal. On some coins, her image was actually larger than her son's. The Emperor of Rome was being visually subordinated to his mother. She attended state meetings. She received foreign ambassadors. She gave orders to generals. She interfered in judicial proceedings. She was, in every practical sense, ruling Rome alongside her teenage son. And Nero noticed. He began to chafe, to resent, to push back in small ways at first, canceling meetings she arranged, contradicting her instructions, spending time with people she disapproved of. One of those people was a woman named Act, a former slave of Greek origin. Beautiful, gentle, uncomplicated. Everything Agrippina was not. Nero fell completely in love with her. Agrippina was furious, not because of morality. Rome's aristocracy was not known for its restraint in matters of love. She was furious because Act had no political value. She couldn't give Nero an alliance, a bloodline, a connection. She was, in Agrippina's calculation, a waste of influence. So Agrippina did what she always did. She pushed. She threatened. She maneuvered. She reportedly even offered herself to Nero, her own body, as a way of reclaiming her control over him. Ancient sources describe witnesses seeing them together in a litter, emerging with disheveled clothing, though historians debate whether the relationship was ever consummated. What is beyond debate is that the dynamic between mother and son had become something deeply poisonous. Nero began to see her not as his mother, but as his enemy. The first person Nero killed was not his mother. It was his stepbrother. Britannicus was the biological son of Claudius, the emperor's real heir, displaced when Nero was adopted. He was 14 years old when Nero had him killed. The method was poison. Sophisticated, precise, Roman poison. Here is how it happened. Tasters were employed at every imperial dinner, a standard precaution against assassination attempts. Any food or drink given to the emperor was tested first. So you couldn't simply poison the cup. What Nero's agents did instead was far more elegant. They gave Britannicus a cup of wine that was too hot to drink. The taster dutifully tested it, safe. Then, in front of the entire dinner party, a servant added cold water to cool the drink. That cold water was the poison. By the time the cup reached Britannicus's lips, it was perfectly lethal. He collapsed to the table. His body seized. Guests froze in horror. Nero didn't move. He didn't panic. He calmly explained that Britannicus suffered from epilepsy, that this was routine, that everyone should continue eating. Some guests believed him. Some were too terrified not to. Britannicus was dead before the night was over. He was 14 years old. Nero was 17. And something had crossed some threshold, some line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Because killing is a different thing the second time, and the third. Each time, the architecture of your conscience shifts slightly, accommodates the new reality, rebuilds itself around the act. Nero had learned that death was a tool, and he had just learned that he knew how to use it. But even after Britannicus, something in Nero resisted the full descent. For years, he governed. He performed. He loved art, music, poetry, theater with a passion that was genuine and deep and almost childlike in its enthusiasm. He wanted desperately to be seen as an artist, not just as an emperor, but as a creator. He sang. He played the lyre. He competed in theatrical contests. This was considered utterly scandalous by Rome's aristocracy. Acting and performing were considered the lowest of arts in Roman culture, appropriate for slaves and freedmen, not for the descendants of gods and generals. For the emperor of Rome to stand on a stage and sing was not just undignified. It was a kind of madness, a category violation so severe it undermined the entire symbolic order of Roman civilization. Nero didn't care. He hired a famous voice trainer named Terpnus and practiced obsessively, lying down with lead weights on his chest to strengthen his diaphragm, following strict dietary restrictions, submitting to purging and fasting in the name of vocal clarity. He would perform for hours. The doors would be locked. No one was allowed to leave. Ancient sources tell stories of people faking death to escape Nero's concerts, of women giving birth in the audience rather than be seen walking out. This was not a man who lacked passion. This was a man whose passion had nowhere safe to go. And then came a relationship that would break whatever remained of his conscience. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. She was described by Tacitus as possessing every gift of fortune except an honorable mind. She was brilliant, beautiful, politically astute, and completely, calculatingly ruthless. She was also married to Otho, one of Nero's closest friends. Nero became obsessed. He could not have her while Octavia, his wife, his legal empress, still lived. He could not have her fully while Agrippina still breathed, because Agrippina would oppose any threat to Nero's political stability. Poppaea whispered in his ear. She questioned his manhood. She questioned his freedom. She asked him over and over why the emperor of Rome, master of the known world, was still afraid of his mother. It was the right question, delivered at exactly the right moment. Nero decided to kill Agrippina. What followed was one of the most darkly comic assassination attempts in all of recorded history. Nero's first plan was a collapsible boat. He would invite his mother to a reconciliation dinner at his villa near Baiae on the Bay of Naples. He would be warm, affectionate, conciliatory. He would give her a special boat to carry her home across the bay. That boat would fall apart in the water. The ceiling of her cabin was rigged with lead weights, designed to collapse and crush her. The hull was built to come apart on a mechanism. He had thought through multiple contingencies. The dinner was warm and loving. Nero was attentive, solicitous, almost tender. Agrippina, who had survived a lifetime of danger, felt, for the first time in perhaps years, something close to relief. She boarded the boat. The ceiling collapsed, but not on Agrippina. It crushed a servant woman sitting nearby, a woman named Acerronia, who, confused or loyal, began shouting that she was Agrippina in hopes of receiving help. She was beaten to death by sailors with oars. Agrippina, having understood immediately what was happening, slipped quietly into the water. She was a strong swimmer. She swam to shore. She sent a message to her son. It said she had survived a terrible accident and was resting. She expected him to come. Nero read the message and reportedly went pale. She was alive. She knew. He sent assassins. 3 of them arrived at her villa that night. They found her alone. Her servants had fled. She saw them enter and understood everything. Ancient sources say she bared her stomach, pointed to her womb, and said, "Strike here." This is where Nero came from. They stabbed her to death. Nero came afterwards to view the body. He reportedly examined it. Her wounds, her limbs, with what observers described as calm, clinical detachment. Some sources say he made comments about her beauty. He was 22 years old. His mother was dead by his order. He sent a letter to the Senate explaining that Agrippina had been plotting against him and had taken her own life when the plot was discovered. The Senate accepted it. They passed decrees of thanksgiving, because in Rome, survival was agreement. After Agrippina, Nero changed. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the guardrails were gone. Seneca, his tutor, his philosophical conscience withdrew. He wrote Nero letters filled with wisdom about moderation and virtue, but they felt increasingly hollow. The words of a man trying to hold back the sea with his hands. Burrus, his military partner, died in 62 AD, possibly of a throat tumor, possibly of poison. With him went the last serious check on Nero's power. And now the full, unfiltered Nero began to emerge. He divorced Octavia, his wife, the beloved daughter of Claudius, a woman the Roman people genuinely respected. He charged her with infertility, then with adultery. She was exiled, then executed. Her head was reportedly brought to Poppaea. He married Poppaea. He continued performing publicly, entering official artistic competitions. In Greece, where the tradition of performance was more accepted, he won, consistently, suspiciously, because no one dared to defeat the emperor. He executed people for entertainment, for slight, for boredom. He ran through the streets at night with gangs of young aristocrats, attacking people, robbing them, throwing them into sewers. There are accounts of him nearly being killed in one of these nocturnal adventures by a senator who didn't recognize him and fought back, after which Nero had the man's career destroyed, because even in play, dominance had to be maintained. He began to believe, genuinely, deeply believe, that he was a god. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually divine. And when you believe you are a god, the normal rules stop applying. Now we arrive at the night that defines him. July 64 AD. The city is a labyrinth. Imagine narrow streets packed between wooden tenement buildings. Insulae, some of them 7 or 8 stories tall, constructed quickly and cheaply to house Rome's swelling population of over 1 million people. These buildings are packed together so tightly that neighbors can shake hands from upper windows. Cooking fires burn constantly. Torches light the streets at night. The entire city is, in a technical sense, a fire waiting to happen. It starts near the Circus Maximus. In a shop district, a small fire, the kind that Rome experiences regularly. It should have been containable. It is not. The flames find the fuel they have been waiting for. They climb the tenements. They leap across the narrow streets. They catch the wooden scaffolding of temples, the awnings of markets, the wooden ceilings of the insulae where the poor sleep 6 to a room. The fire burns for 6 days. Then it pauses briefly. Then it starts again in a different location. Suspicious. By the time it is over, 3 of Rome's 14 districts have been completely destroyed. 7 more are heavily damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people are homeless. Ancient temples dating back centuries are ash. The Circus Maximus, capable of holding 250,000 spectators, is gone. Rome has not seen destruction like this since the Gauls sacked the city in 390 BC. And where was Nero? Nero had them arrested by the hundreds. He had them tortured until they named others. He invented executions that were essentially performance art. Christians were sewn into animal skins and hunted by dogs in the arena. They were crucified in his private gardens. They were covered in pitch, tied to poles, and set alight as living torches to illuminate his evening garden parties. Nero reportedly walked among them as they burned, hosting dinner for Rome's elite, admiring the spectacle. This is the moment that would echo through 2,000 years of history. The Roman persecution of Christians under Nero would become foundational to Christian identity, the first great martyrdom, the template for every persecution that followed. The Book of Revelation, written in this era, is almost certainly a coded document about Nero. The number 666, the number of the beast, translates in Hebrew numerology directly to Nero Caesar. He wasn't just a bad emperor. He was the prototype for the Antichrist. Meanwhile, the empire was fracturing. In 66 AD, Judea erupted in open revolt, a massive, bloody rebellion that would take 4 years and the full military power of Rome to suppress. It would end with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, one of the most consequential events in the history of religion. In Britain, a queen named Boudicca had already led a revolt that came terrifyingly close to driving Rome out of the island entirely. Her forces killing an estimated 70,000 Romans and Roman allies before being finally crushed. Nero's response to these crises was often erratic, paranoid, and self-defeating. He appointed generals based on personal loyalty rather than military competence. He held to imperial prerogatives when flexibility was needed. He executed advisors whose advice he didn't want to hear. He was losing the empire the same way a child loses a pet, through carelessness and distraction and the conviction that nothing he loved could ever actually leave. And then he killed Poppaea, the woman he had murdered his mother to be with, the woman he had destroyed his wife for, the woman he had claimed to love above all others. She was pregnant. In a fit of rage, sources disagree about the cause. Some say she criticized him for coming home late from the races. Nero kicked her. She died from the injury. He wept. He mourned publicly and extravagantly. He found a freedman named Sporus who bore a physical resemblance to Poppaea, had him castrated, dressed him in women's clothes, and married him in a formal ceremony. Rome watched in horrified silence. He then found a woman named Statilia Messalina, had her husband executed, and married her as well. He now had, simultaneously, a castrated male wife dressed as a woman, and a female wife whose husband he had murdered to obtain her. Even by the standards of his predecessors, this was something new. The conspiracies began to gather. In 65 AD, a broad coalition of senators, military officers, and even members of Nero's own household organized what became known as the Pisonian Conspiracy. Named for Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the aristocrat they intended to put on the throne. It was the most serious challenge to Nero's rule, and it failed. A freedwoman named Epicharus had been attempting to recruit naval officers to the cause. One of them betrayed her. The conspiracy unraveled rapidly, as conspiracies and paranoid systems always do, each arrested man desperately naming others to save himself, each new name opening new threads. The purge that followed was catastrophic. 19 people were executed immediately. Among them was Seneca, Nero's old tutor, his philosophical father, the man who had tried for decades to make him something better. Nero sent word that Seneca should kill himself. The old man, 70 years old, opened his veins in his bath. He bled slowly. He dictated final thoughts to scribes until the end. A poet named Lucan, one of the finest writers of his era, was also executed. His last act was to recite his own poetry as he died. The general Corbulo, perhaps the finest military mind Rome possessed, received a single-word command from Nero. He fell on his own sword. Nero was systematically destroying his own greatest assets out of fear. In 67 AD, Nero traveled to Greece for an extended artistic tour. He entered every major festival: the Olympics, the Pythian Games, the Isthmian Games, the Nemean Games. He sang. He acted. He raced chariots. He won every single competition he entered. In the chariot race at the Olympics, he fell from his chariot and didn't finish. He was still awarded first place. He came back to Rome with 1,808 first-place crowns. While he was gone, he had transferred effective governance to a freedman named Helius. Rome was being administered by a former slave. The legions on the frontiers were growing restless. Then came a year of catastrophe. 68 AD, a governor named Gaius Julius Vindex in Gaul raised a revolt. Nero heard the news without particular alarm. Vindex was suppressed by his own colleagues. But the suppression revealed something terrifying. The legions were no longer acting on Nero's orders. They were acting on their own judgment. In Spain, a governor named Servius Sulpicius Galba, 70 years old, cold, methodical, declared himself emperor. Nero still believed he could manage this. He had survived everything else. And then the Praetorian Guard, his personal bodyguard, the most powerful military force in the city, the soldiers who had made and destroyed emperors since Tiberius, switched their allegiance to Galba. Nero woke up one night to find his bedroom empty. His guards were gone. His servants were gone. His advisors had fled. He ran from room to room in the palace calling out names that no one answered. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The penalty for a public enemy in Rome was the ancient punishment: fustigatio, beaten to death with rods. Nero fled. He fled with 4 companions, a secretary named Epaphroditus and 3 freedmen. Riding through the night, wrapped in cloaks, with pillows tied over his face to avoid recognition, he made for a villa owned by one of the freedmen for miles outside Rome, hiding in a ditch when he heard hoofbeats on the road. Ancient sources say he lay there in the ditch, the man who had been master of the world, and drank water from a puddle. He reached the villa. He hid in a back room. He could hear horsemen searching the area. He tried to stab himself. He couldn't do it. He begged his companions to show him how. He asked them to practice the motion first to demonstrate the courage he needed. He began to cry. A messenger arrived. The horsemen were close. Epaphroditus, his secretary, guided the blade. Nero pushed. He stabbed himself in the throat, but not cleanly. He was still breathing when a Roman officer burst into the room. The officer, perhaps trying to seem helpful, tried to stop the wound. Nero looked at him. Too late, he reportedly said. He died on June 9th, 68 AD. He was 30 years old. He had ruled Rome for 13 years. The woman who had given birth to him, who had poisoned an emperor, who had maneuvered through every trap the most dangerous family in the world could set. She had been dead for 9 years, killed on his order. His first wife, Octavia, had been killed on his order. Britannicus had been killed on his order. Seneca, Lucan, Corbulo, hundreds of senators, thousands of Christians, and at the end, in a ditch, then in a back room of a freedman's villa, he had needed someone else to help him die. He was buried by his 2 surviving nurses and a former mistress. Act, the freed slave girl he had loved as a teenager, the uncomplicated love that Agrippina had despised. She paid for his funeral herself. She covered his body in white robes. She buried him, the emperor of Rome, buried by the woman everyone had told him wasn't good enough. Now, let us step back, because the story of Nero raises a question that matters far beyond ancient Rome. Was Nero simply evil? Was he born this way? Or was he the product of a system specifically designed to produce monsters? Consider what surrounded him from the moment of his birth. A mother whose love was inseparable from manipulation. A family that had normalized murder as governance for 3 generations. A court where honesty was potentially lethal. A Senate that applauded his worst acts to survive. Guards and servants who enabled every excess. He grew up in a world where no one ever said no. Not truly. Not consistently. Not when it cost them. He grew up in a world where every weakness he displayed was exploited by those closest to him. Where every genuine emotion became a liability. Where art, the only language he seemed to speak naturally, was considered a source of shame. Compare him to Augustus, the architect of the empire, a man of iron self-discipline who used power as a surgeon uses a scalpel. Augustus understood that power exercised with restraint lasts. Power exercised without limits destroys itself. Nero never learned that lesson. No one taught it to him in a way that penetrated. The philosophers tried. Seneca wrote about it for years. But wisdom delivered to a boy who has been told since birth that he is divine lands differently than wisdom delivered to a boy who has been taught that he is human. Compare him to Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor who came a century later, who wrote to himself every morning to remind himself of his own smallness, who treated the imperial throne as a responsibility rather than a reward, who knew that the gap between a good emperor and a tyrant was simply the discipline to govern himself before governing others. Nero had no such discipline. He never developed it. The system around him actively prevented it. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing decades after Nero's death, with access to primary sources and living memory, describes a man who lived in almost constant contradiction. He was generous to the poor and brutally punitive with rivals. He was genuinely skilled as an artist and genuinely terrible as a general. He could weep over a dead canary and order the execution of a senator without blinking. He was not the cartoon villain that later centuries made him. He was something more disturbing. He was a real person, shaped by real forces, who made real choices in a context specifically designed to make the worst choices feel inevitable. And that is the thing about power without accountability. It doesn't just corrupt the person who holds it. It corrupts everyone around that person. It corrupts the institutions that should provide checks. It corrupts the advisors who should provide truth. It corrupts the historians who are afraid to write honestly while the powerful still live. The Praetorian Guard that abandoned Nero in his final days, they had made him. Their predecessors had murdered his predecessors and elevated his family. Every mechanism that was supposed to limit imperial power had been gradually dismantled by the time Nero inherited it. He was given everything, and given nothing that mattered. After Nero's death, Rome entered the year of the four emperors, a violent chaos in which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian all fought for control within the space of a single year. Galba was murdered by the Praetorian Guard. Otho, Poppaea's first husband, the man Nero had sent away to steal his wife, killed himself after a military defeat. Vitellius was dragged through the streets and killed by a mob. Vespasian finally stabilized the empire and founded a new dynasty. But in the provinces of the east, something strange happened. People refused to believe Nero was dead. False Neros appeared, 3 of them the years following his death, claiming to be the emperor, gathering followings, causing real political disturbances. The last of these appeared 20 years after Nero's actual death and was taken seriously enough to nearly cause a diplomatic crisis between Rome and Parthia. In the east, among people who had experienced Nero as a distant figure rather than an immediate tyrant, he was mourned. Flowers were placed on his tomb for years. Perhaps they saw in him what Rome and its cruelty had failed to cultivate. The artist who wanted to be loved, not feared. The performer who wanted applause, not submission. Perhaps they saw the boy before the monster. Or perhaps they simply preferred their own Nero to the cold generals who followed him. History is always partly the story we need it to be. So here, finally, is the answer to the question we started with. How does a boy become a monster? Not all at once. Not through a single dark choice in a single dark moment. He becomes one gradually, through accumulated decisions, each of which feels survivable, even necessary, in the moment. Through the slow erosion of every relationship that might have told him the truth. Through the systematic removal of every consequence that might have taught him where the limits are. He becomes a monster the way Rome became an empire. One conquered territory at a time. The tragedy of Nero is not that he was uniquely evil. The tragedy is that he was, in the deepest sense, entirely ordinary. An ordinary person, given extraordinary power, surrounded by people too afraid or too ambitious to help him be better. That story is not ancient history. That story is still happening. Which makes me want to ask you something. We live in an age of unprecedented power, where individuals can influence millions, where institutions can be built or destroyed overnight, where the systems that should check power are constantly under pressure. If Nero were born today, the same boy, the same gifts, the same wounds, what would he become? What would we make him? Think about it. And if you want to understand how the empire that created Nero eventually fell apart, how the greatest civilization in the ancient world collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, I'll tell you that story next time. Because the fall of Rome is not just a historical event. It is a warning, and we are not paying nearly enough attention.
Must fall. Rome's fate echoes through the ages, a lesson for those who follow.